Now, here in India, we knew that once we chose whatever we did, whichever strategy we did, we would end up in a bad situation because it would mean that once you go down that path, you can't change it. With 1.35 billion people, you can't change path. So what do you do? So we took the view that we had no idea what was going to happen. In other words, we were dealing with complete uncertainty. If you are dealing with complete uncertainty, how do you make policy? So there are many strategies for dealing with complete uncertainty. One strategy is known as the barbell strategy, where basically what you do is you hedge for the very worst outcome on one hand, and then you do a Bayesian updating over time as more information becomes available. So this is basically the context in which we did the first original lockdown. What were we doing? We were hedging for the very worst outcome. In case it turned out that COVID was just as as dangerous as the very worst expectations of the most pessimistic expert, then at least we had shut down the system. Now, it's not like we didn't know there was a major economic cost to be paid from it. Of course, everybody knew that. But we had to do that because if the very worst thing was going to happen, it was going to spread through the whole system and kill millions of people, then the best we could do is to shut down the system right in the beginning, while we did the second part of the barbell, which is step by step gather more information. So that first lockdown was about gathering more information, putting in place some quarantining, testing capability, and so on and so forth. Now, as time passed, we had better information about it. So we found out that it's particularly bad for a certain cohort, people with comorbidities, older people, and so on. We found out that it affects the lungs and breathing and so on. And so we began to get a certain amount of information that's airborne, for example, that masks makes a difference. So then you begin putting in place certain steps that then you begin to take. And meanwhile, you begin to open things up. And so if you remember, the cases peaked last year in September. But by September, we had substantially opened up the economy. Now, people will immediately ask, why were you opening up the system where in September, when you had lots of more cases than when you had shut it down in the beginning? Well, for obvious reasons, because we had more information. If we have more information, we therefore knew that, well, while it was very dangerous, it wasn't quite as dangerous as the worst case. We also knew that there were certain things we could do to mitigate the risks. So that is the context in which we kept things shut. So now we did exactly the same thing with economic policy. We basically, when we shut things down, we knew there would be a big economic price to be paid. If you're shutting down an economy for several weeks at a time, it doesn't take a genius to realize that there's a price to be paid. But then, if you will remember, a lot of experts came and said, you must reinflate the economy, open it up and sort of pump it as fast as possible. Well, wait a minute. This is not a demand side problem. The real problem is a supply one where you have shut down the system. That is the real problem. And you don't want to pump up demand too quickly because you have, for health reasons, shut things down. So rather than go and do these $1 trillion reinflation packages, which many countries did, and at least in my view, not very successfully, we did much more controlled effort, where just like with the barbell strategy, we basically spent the money on the most vulnerable sections of society. So the world's largest food program, 800 million people were given food. We put some money into the Jan Dhan accounts. This was not, as many people said, oh, too little to kind of reinflate the economy. We weren't trying to reinflate the economy, but we were providing a safety net. Same thing we did with the MSME sector. We provided liquidity. We held the insolvency and bankruptcy code in abeyance because we didn't want cascades of defaults going through the system. Why were we doing all of this? Well, this is one part of the barbell. You're providing a safety net. This is not an attempt to reinflate the economy at all. On the other side, we recognize that we were in a marathon and not a sprint. We therefore calibrated, did a series of medium-sized packages while we opened things up. And when you remember in October last year, we then began to ramp up capital expenditure. Why capital expenditure? Well, because it has many very strong multiplier effects on demand, and you saw the economy came back very sharply between October and March, so much so that in the Jan to October quarter, we were back to where we were before COVID. It's a different matter that we got hit by the second wave, but you can see that this is an iterative process where we are continuously updating ourselves with information. This is not based on some grand model looking forward or our ability to predict forward. We have accepted the fact that we do not know how to predict if and when a second wave will come. And by the way, if and when a third wave will come. I know there are many IITs and various experts who have all these models. Well, it's impossible to tell ex ante which of those models will tell you what is going to happen. You see, if enough monkeys throw darts at the dartboard, one or two of them is going to hit the bullseye. The problem is it's very difficult to tell which monkey is going to hit the bullseye. So in those circumstances, it is better to assume that we do not know. So the premium here is not our ability to forecast, but our ability to do two things. One, to hedge for the very worst outcome. Two, to do continuous surveillance and respond quickly. So this is a reactive model at its first instance in the short to medium term. So you can see this is one part of the way we are thinking about it. So the same approach was applied in the second wave. We allowed to decentralize the response to COVID because by this point we had better information, and we decided that the state governments are able to respond much faster than the central government. For obvious reasons, they are closer to the ground. So it makes much more sense to decentralize lockdowns, and this is exactly what we did. So although the health spike was much more severe in the second wave, the health response did not have a national lockdown. Why? For the very simple reason, we took the view that if this is a feedback-based system, then this is clearly going to be much better run on the ground. We had initially also thought that this was the case with vaccination, incidentally, but we decided later on that this was better run centralized. Again, feedback loop, we found that it runs better from a centralized system, and indeed that has been the case. So this is one case where a centralized system works better, and you can see that we have been able to ramp up vaccination dramatically, and we are now routinely hitting as many as 10 million in a day of vaccination jabs. So again, feedback loop based system. Now, this you may argue is all right in the short run, but how do you go forward? Well, same situation for the response to COVID. I am a much bigger advocate of continuous testing and surveillance as opposed to great belief in anybody's models. So do not believe anybody's models, just do continuously keep a high level of testing going. And you would have seen that if you look at the testing numbers. After the first wave, the testing levels slowly drifted down. We have tried to keep the testing levels as high as possible. And by the way, in other countries, you will see testing goes up and down quite a lot. In our case, while there is some ups and downs, but by and large, the testing pace remains at a reasonably high level, even after the number of cases have come down. And that is an important part of our strategy because surveillance is an important part of our approach. Similarly, making sure what is the positivity rate, watching that very carefully is an important part of our strategy. Now, the same thing is being done on the economic front. We are opening things up gingerly, maybe, but we are opening things up. And by and large, except for things like international travel and other things where we have still some health concerns, we have tried to open things up. So, of course, you got in the April to June quarter, 20% GDP growth, which on a year-on-year basis happened at least partly because of the fact that you had a low base. But remember, this year's quarter in the second wave also had some lockdown. So it's not an entirely open system that you're comparing it with. Nevertheless, you have seen a significant part of the economy coming back. Into this quarter also, you are seeing things coming back. Now, our intention is to keep things as open as possible, even if a third wave comes, obviously keeping in mind various health restrictions that we may have to impose. But keeping things as open as possible is an important part of our strategy. And again, it's important in this context to be, the situation awareness is a very important part of what we want to do.